Aaron Bobrow-Strain is Associate Professor of Politics in Whitmore College. His writing on food, immigration, and the US-Mexico border has appeared in The Believer, The Chronicle of Higher Education Review, Salon, Gastronomica, and the Huffington Post. He's the author of White Bread, A Social History of the Store-Bought Loaf, and Intimate Enemies, Landowners, Power, and Violence in Chiapas. Héctor Tobar is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and novelist. He's the author of the critically acclaimed New York Times bestseller, Deep Down Dark, as well as The Barbarian Nurseries, Translation Nation, and The Tattooed Soldier. Héctor is also a contributing writer for the New York Times opinion pages and an associate professor at the University of California, Irvine. He's written for the New Yorker, the Los Angeles Times, and other publications, and his short fiction has appeared in the Best American Short Stories, LA Noir, and Slate. Son of Guatemalan immigrants, he's a native of Los Angeles, where he lives with his family. Please join me in using your clap reaction function to welcome Aaron and Héctor to your living rooms.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having us. It's a great honor here to be with Aaron and to be with you all virtually and also on into the future here in the recording that we're going to make from this. So Aaron, you have had an incredible career. You started off as a geographer. You've written about cooking. And now you're on to this incredible immigration story that is probably the defining story of our times, I think, in so many ways, and of our country. So you start off as a geographer. What is it that drew you to the place where most of this story takes place? Douglas, Arizona, Agua Prieta, Mexico. Why did this place speak to you?
Yeah, I mean, you're right that coming out of geography, or maybe the reason I went into geography is just because place is often what draws me first to a story and a connection to place. And I had spent a bunch of time working on the US-Mexico border in the early 1990s and kept returning to it over the next 20 some years, bringing my own students from Whitman College, returning to do other projects on the border. So, and one thing that gets left out of a lot of reporting on the US-Mexico border, particularly reporting that's really just focused on crisis, immigration crisis, is really that this is just an incredibly beautiful and rich and creative place, right? The borderlands where people are crossing boundaries of language and culture and geopolitical boundaries all the time. It's just a fantastic, beautiful landscape. And so I just wanted to be there. But at the same time, I knew that this incredibly beautiful place, the borderlands, had been set up as a sacrifice zone, really a sacrifice zone to our country's worst fears and hatreds and political ambitions and corporate greed. And so I guess it was around January 2014, I went back with the idea of trying to understand how people were living their life in that contradiction, right? Communities that were really one community, united, not divided by a border, but grappling with the fact that now, at that point, some 20 years of border hardening had really driven wedges between the two sides of their community. So trying to understand that.
Right, you describe them as these two towns, Douglas and Agua Prieta. They're almost one. Before the 1990s and before this crackdown that begins really during the Clinton administration, when they started building these fences in El Paso and in San Isidro and other places, and also on the Arizona border in the urban areas. These towns really have kind of a joint existence. People are used to going back and forth.
Yeah, in fact, some people refer to them as Dogla Prieta, just making the town name into one. And you can think about people not much older. So the book centers on Aida Hernandez, who's a young, undocumented immigrant growing up in Douglas in the 1990s, early 2000s. And people, so she's in her teens and early 20s at that point. But people not much older than her talk about time when they would play baseball games in the summer, where home plate would be in the United States and the outfield would be in Mexico. and that, you know, people might cross over through the old ratty old chain link fence to go to their barber or get tortillas or the better pan dulce or something like that. Not because they were evading inspection, but just because it was a more convenient route to the barber. So yeah, thinking about that. And then there's another, go ahead, yeah.
No, go ahead, please. I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say the other piece of that is that once I got there, I realized, and this became really crucial to understanding the story, was that you can't just think of the border or you can't just think of border communities as a kind of backdrop for the drama of immigration only, because Douglas has this rich, powerful history of labor organizing. In fact, Mexican-American union organizers in Douglas helped champion and lay the groundwork for the post-war rise of unions in the United States. Were critical in one of the key Supreme Court cases that establishes the strong right to organize after World War II. So this really rich, incredible history that then in 1987 gets pulled out from underneath Douglas's feet with the closing down of the copper smelter. It had been something of a kind of copper company town before 1987, but in this moment of Reagan era anti-union activism, Douglas really loses in some ways the thing that gave it meaning, and understanding how that trauma, the trauma of deindustrialization, which isn't that different from like the town in Michigan that lost its auto parts factory, how much that shapes people's consciousness and the way they respond to the border dynamic today as well.
Yeah, I thought it was really lovely. And I know that my students at UC Irvine who read your book also thought it was just really impressive the way you wove this community's history with the story of the woman who becomes your protagonist, you know, Aida Hernandez, because she grows up in some of these neighborhoods that were once, they had better times during the age of the smelter and when the company, the smelter company was doing well. But then she also has this life that is a cross-border life. You know, it's a life that has its share of domestic violence and also its, you know, acts of beauty and family unity. And all these things, even before she gets thrust into the machinery of immigration detention, even before all of that happens, it's a cross-border story. She's living on both sides.
Yeah. No, I mean, and that's just the kind of, it's normal. And I think it's hard for folks who don't have experience on the border, who might see the border as this hard, defined geopolitical line, to really grasp the way a community can be united in that way. So yeah, and it also gets at the question of class, right, as well, because of, you know, Aida is growing up both undocumented, and because of that deindustrialization, she's growing up poor as well. And, you know, what we've seen, and here Douglas is, again, not that different, even though it has this unique border location, is that deindustrialization in communities of color doesn't tend to be met with elegies and empathy, so much as calls for harsher policing and more incarceration. And that's what Aida grows up in. Is that a town that has gone in some ways, this is maybe an exaggeration, but in some ways gone from being a copper company town to being a homeland security or a law enforcement company. Where 1 in 7 adult men in Douglas work for law enforcement in 2014.
Yeah. I mean, to me, that was incredible. Just the way you describe the way this border industrial complex, this detention industrial complex descends on the town, you know, all the different law enforcement agencies that descend on the town and the construction of the fence. It really is kind of horrific in a way. And I think that, you know, obviously you came to the town to document this and to sort of experience this. And then you describe in the book meeting Aida for the first time. You've sort of put out feelers for what you're doing. You want to write a book about how the immigration wars are affecting this town. Someone tells you about her and her story. When did you realize, it was actually a Douglas social worker, right, who tells you about her story. When did you realize that you were going to write a book about her specifically, you know?
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, so the story is, it was early on in my time in Douglas, a woman named Rosy Mendoza became one of my main guides to Douglas. And if you've read the book, you know that she is just a badass, formerly undocumented social worker who works with victims or people experiencing domestic and sexual violence in the border. And so she kind of said, like, there's this woman who had been a client who then became a friend, and I can't tell you, for privacy reasons, I can't tell you anything about her, but I'm going to tell her about your project, and if she wants to call you, she will, and if she does call you, you should definitely talk to her and hear what she has to say. And it took a long, there's kind of a funny story in the book about how we ended up finally getting in touch. But to make it short, we ended up meeting on a wintry day in the 10th Street Park, or the Raul Castro Park, and sitting next to a fountain, and she told her story, and it, you know, I had not anticipated or planned at all to write a book about one person. That was definitely not in my plan, going to Douglas. But I realized that she just had this incredibly powerful message for those of us who look at the border from a more privileged position. I also hadn't at all intended to make violence against women a central theme of a border book. But I realized in that conversation, and then also talking with Rosy and other people, that you cannot understand our approach to border security right now without understanding the way it makes women's lives less secure on the border. So that was there was kind of a moment where it was just so clear how powerful this story was. Of course, from there, you know, the long and difficult conversations and going back and forth about, you know, whether and how I could write a book like this ethically. And, you know, Aida actually was strong from the start that she was interested in that. You know, she said, in terms of going public, she said, you know, Aaron, I've already dealt with the worst possible people you can imagine. At least telling my story can be part of my healing and a way to take what I've experienced and turn it into something that can make a difference. But there were still a lot of questions to be answered about the risks and you know, pitfalls of doing a project like that. So it was a pretty instant realization that this was a powerful and important story to tell. And then a longer process of reflection about whether and how to tell it.
Well, you know, there's a lot of trauma in this book. You know, there is. She grows up. Aida grows up with in the situation where there's a lot of domestic violence in her home. She has relationships. Is married to a man who is violent, and then she suffers halfway through the book, which is what the title refers to when you say the death and life of Aida Hernandez. She has this attack where she is almost mortally wounded. I mean, she's very close to dying, and there's this dramatic sort of cross-border attempt to rescue her and save her life. How did you talk to her about so much trauma? I mean, that's something that I think, is there, you know, was that difficult? And you know, explain, can you sort of, I just was curious as to how you built up this relationship so that she would share so much of her vulnerability and so much stuff that was so personal to her.
Yeah, I mean, hands down, the most important thing was that she is just an incredibly courageous person who really felt the power of telling her story publicly and was willing to do that. So without that courage, none of it would have happened. I think in terms of the trauma, you know, there's the trauma of poverty, our immigration system. If you read the book and the kind of the history of the immigration system, I unpack our immigration system is explicitly, intentionally designed to produce trauma, particularly on it's not an incidental, it's the intention. The border isn't broken, it's working more or less as intended, and that's the problem. So yeah, there's these layers of trauma. You know, one thing is that we talked a lot about and made sure that Aida was talking with her therapists about the experience of telling her story and making sure it was the right thing to do throughout the whole project. And then I think also strategically, for some of the parts that were most traumatic in the story, I tended to go over them once or twice with her. And, you know, from doing these kinds of oral history and interview-based projects that, you know, it often requires going over a story 10 or 12 times to really fully get it. But with some of the more traumatic parts, I tried to kind of not go over them once or twice and really get the details down, and then not revisit them a lot over and over again with Aida, and then use other things like documents, medical records, court records, family members, interviews with family members and friends and things like that to flesh out many of the details, which was also crucial because trauma messes with memory.
Wow.
So I had to kind of really work with other people and other kinds of documents to make sure that that I was doing justice to that story as well. So there was an aspect of trying to protect, but also there was a sense that telling the story publicly was a way to heal. And I think some of the things I read about trauma talk about how there's a process in which and PTSD, there's a process through which you turn the past into a memory by telling the story. Whereas with PTSD, as I've come to understand it, it's that the past isn't past, it's fully present in the moment. You're experiencing it as if it were happening. And telling the story is one way to try to turn that into a memory.
Well, one of the things that's really remarkable is that as Aida goes through all these events that are very traumatic, she ends up in immigration detention, which of course is a sort of factory of trauma, as you say. And yet, even within like her darkest circumstances, she never seems to lose her volition, like her will to shape her life and to shape her future. I mean, to me, the most remarkable thing is that in the middle of this immigration detention, you have a love story, right? She falls in love, you know, and she falls in love with this wonderful Ecuadorian woman whose story you tell at length as an aside, which I thought was so remarkable in itself, a great, wonderful sort of side story. And at one point, the Ecuadorian woman says, you know, she finds out she's going to be released, and her reaction is no, because she doesn't want to leave. Her lover is in immigration detention, and I just thought it was really remarkable that you had this ear for that. You had this ear for their volition and their free will. You know,
thank you. That's crucial, and I think that, and it's not to and I don't want to, and the book doesn't undersell the horrific conditions in immigration detention. And in fact, when I was writing big chunks of the parts about immigration detention, I remember thinking, like, I really have to verify and cross-check and support every single thing I'm saying in these sections, because no one is going to believe how bad the situation is. And, you know, over the past couple of years since I wrote that, or the first drafts of those sections, there's been a lot of reporting and work by activists and immigrants in detention that really now we have a better understanding of those conditions and the brutality of those conditions. But often that reporting treats undocumented people in detention as victims, just passive victims of the system. And I think that was one of the most powerful things I learned about the detention system, is how much people in detention are able to resist and maintain their humanity. And we're seeing this today in the age of coronavirus, where all around the country, people in immigration detention are going on hunger strikes and protesting the health and safety conditions in immigration detention. And you see that, and the community that people form in detention was also something I had not expected. Kind of against all odds, you would think. I remember Aida describing, she's been in Border Patrol custody, which is really horrific. In fact, the Border Patrol custody center where she was in was just the subject of a major lawsuit that the Border Patrol lost because of the horrific conditions. And Border Patrol agents have been taunting her about how bad immigration detention is going to be and trying to make her afraid of what's coming as she's transferred to this other immigration detention center. And then she walks in and she's like, what the? Because she describes it, it looked kind of like a bunch of middle-aged Latin American women at a hair salon sitting around gossiping and making makeup out of red Twizzler candy. And again, and it's not to deny the horrific conditions and the suffering and the fact that all of these people were separated from their family long before family separation was in the news. This was family separation in action. But still, that focusing on the agency and the way people are able to build community and resistance in those conditions, I think is crucial to telling an immigration story, and often forgotten.
Well, I also noted in the afterword that you have that you visited some of these immigration detention centers, and the one specifically where she was, which is one of these for-profit immigration centers. But you visited almost every important place in the book. You went to, of course, Douglas Agua Prieta. Later, Aida ends up in New York. You went to Huehuetenango, Guatemala, which is actually where my grandmother is from. You went to Ecuador. You went to the Lecumberri prison. And, for those of you who haven't read this book, it's an incredible epic. It just has so many incredible just locations. So you go to the Lecumberri prison in Mexico City. Why is that important to you? I mean, is it something that helps you sort of create this novelistic feel of the piece, of the book?
Yeah, for sure. And in Truth in Advertising, and I mentioned this in the book as well, that some of those places I visited before this book was an idea. So Ecuador I visited a long time ago, but just to be able to have that sense of place and to be able to describe that sense of place and the feel and the smells. And of course, I lived in Mexico for several years and doing research, and have spent quite a bit of time in Mexico. And one of the most moving comments I got on a draft early on was a friend of mine who's undocumented Mexican who can't go back home, would love to be able to go visit his home. And he talked about how there was just this one little description of a grocery store and what a grocery store smelled like that made him weep. Because it reminded him of home. And I think you have to go to be able to, you have to be in a place and get a feel for it in order to be able to tell a story like that. So that was really crucial. And then places where I couldn't go, we were just chatting about this before the event started, but using other kinds of tools like Google Street View. I found an amazing documentary filmed in Lecumberri prison right at the time when the character in the book Raul was in that prison, and so being able to get that incredible visual sense. There was also a very bizarre, Fox News did this very bizarre thing where it was just a 45-minute camera panning through the entire Eloy Corrections Corporation of American Detention Center, showing every single place in the detention center. So that was a huge, and I found that on YouTube randomly. So being able to kind of get that visual sense is really crucial to creating an immersive story.
Yeah, you kind of wonder how people wrote books before the internet existed, just because it opens up an entire world of sensations and information and imagery.
Yeah.
And I think to me, that's the most remarkable part of this book is how much of it feels like a novel, and it just feels so incredibly intimate. And you have this, we follow this woman's life, but you also feel free to take these incredible side trips. There's this story, for example, about northern Mexico and Aida's father. That Aida's father is a political activist who actually becomes part of a small band of guerrillas who try to start a guerrilla war in northern Mexico, which to me was, it blew me away when I read that. I was so surprised. So was there a part of writing this where it was especially hard to sort of create that novelistic feel to the book, where it was especially hard to sort of give it those kinds of textures? Was there a part where it was most difficult to research?
Yeah. I mean, definitely the most difficult to research. I mean, boy, that's an interesting question. Some of the parts in detention were difficult to research because most of the people that Aida was in touch with in the detention center were deported. Very few people win their case. 85% of the women in that detention center statistically didn't have an attorney defending them. In some, Aida actually becomes the detention center attorney in many ways because she's completely bilingual, bicultural, and is able to translate immigration documents. So I was able to track down some people that she was in detention with, a couple, but I would have, to confirm and verify the stories she was telling about detention, but I would have loved to have more. I had to supplement it with, court recordings from the immigration trial, and just general reporting on immigration detention. Well, I had a student, an amazing student who was a research assistant on the book project, who for her own research did interviews with women in detention that also helped kind of flesh out the story. So you had to kind of find workarounds and other ways of getting at places that were technically shut off to you. I think that's the kind of strategies that I had to employ. And then, some of it was actually just kind of fun. Like there were times when Aida and I watched Chola makeup tutorial videos on YouTube together. So I could kind of get the feel of that.
That's dedication, Aaron. That's real dedication. When you're watching Chola videos with your subject, that's taking it to a high level. Absolutely. Well, Aida herself, the other thing about her that I really like is how complex she is. She repeatedly sabotages herself. She's not the perfect immigrant. And you mentioned this, that there's this whole sort of cult of the perfect dreamer, the person who goes on to law school and goes to, in the news media, there's this whole figure of the miraculous undocumented immigrant who ends up getting a PhD or going to medical school. Aida isn't that kind of person. Aida, not that any of them really exist. I mean, I think even the PhD has, it's a struggle to get to that point, but she sabotages herself over and over again. And there were so many times that it was, you must have felt just frustrated for her, recounting this moment when she would sabotage herself.
Yeah. And, it's the kind of thing where the first time Aida told her story to me, she told a more stylized version of the story, as one does, right? If you were to tell your life story right now, you would tell a more stylized version. And it was over the course of more than 4 years of working together that some of those other aspects came out. And I think that was a big piece of the courage, is the realization that, we talked a lot about how that the book would never portray her as a demon or a saint. It had to portray her as a real, flawed, brilliant human person. And I think that's central to making it a powerful story. But it's also central to the politics of the book, which is that, as you were saying, like it's difficult to overstate how central to our immigration debates in the United States, even to our sense of the United States as a nation of immigrants, this impossible binary between the flawless, innocent, high-achieving, quote-unquote, good immigrant, and who maybe deserves sympathy and maybe deserves rights, and then the so-called bad criminal alien who deserves all the punishment she can get. And actually, Rosy Mendoza says to Aida several times in the book, she says, Aida, humans make mistakes, but immigrants can't. And particularly since the 1990s, there's been a narrowing of possibility within the immigration system to make less and less room for mistakes making a more and more unforgiving and punitive system. So it was really crucial, the fact that Aida, when she told her story, she didn't disown her past mistakes. She didn't solicit pity. Her story just burned with pride and sufficiency as it was. And I think that was a really powerful message, that folks whose lives, their messy human lives, don't fit into that impossible binary, right? Which is everyone, basically, are also makers of their communities and members of their community, and should be recognized as such legally, right? You know, Aida is fully a maker and a member of her community, regardless of the fact that she maybe doesn't fit the externally imposed images of like high achieving or perfection or flawlessness that for some reason folks think they can demand of members of their community.
Yeah, and I think that's just what makes her so interesting, is that she feels so real, you know? Well, we have a question here in our chat. And it took me a while. I looked at it a little while ago, and I was at first a little perplexed, but then I can see where I think the questioner is coming from. And that question is, can you compare Manuel Puig's, he's an Argentine Uruguayan writer, Beso de la Mujer Araña, with your work? And at first I thought, what? You know, but yes, Beso de la Mujer Araña, for those of you who don't know, is this love story between two men, actually, that takes place in a prison in South America, later made into a film, I think with Raul Julia in it. And so, yeah, do you see any comparisons at all between your work and that classic work of American literature? I mean, that's Latin American literature.
Latin American literature. Wow. That's going to take me back to my Latin American literature class in like 1989, which was a while ago. So, I don't think I can wax poetically about the parallels, but just to reinforce the idea of the ways in which people create humanity and resistance and connection in these contexts that seem like they're states of exception, where people are thrust outside of society into this horrific kind of rightsless situation, but are still able to craft community and connection in that. And I think that's just a powerful, beautiful message. So I'll have to go revisit that novel. I hadn't made that connection, but it's a good one.
Well, that leads to another question that I have, which is, it's sort of a standard writer question, but also one that I know I sense that you have an answer to, which is, are there literary influences when you sit down to write? When you sat down to write this book, or when you sit down to write it all, are there voices in your head that are your muses or your conscience, that have helped shape this book or other books you've written?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, obviously, and it's funny because I was coming at this, right? I'm an academic, and I'm an academic trying to write a novelistic piece of nonfiction, and I had written nonfiction for non-academic audiences in the past, in magazines, and a book, the White Bread book, was written for a non-academic audience, but I had never tackled a narrative. A piece of narrative or literary nonfiction of this type before. So I really did have to learn a lot of the tools and techniques, but that was what made this so, for me, a personally kind of exciting project, was trying to bring together the tools of novelists with the kind of the rigorous scholarly research, which is something that I don't think scholars do enough. I think academics should. Novelists have been borrowing from scholarly research for a very long time, and some do it extremely well. But it doesn't tend to go the other direction. So I was trying to think, how can we use the tools of novel writing? So yeah, absolutely. But I don't have a really like high quality literary kind of cool answer to that question, because part of what I did was I realized that this story was filled with suspense and kind really intense uncertainty, and Aida fighting against impossible odds to make a place for herself and her son in the United States. So one thing I actually started to do is I started to just look at some more like pulp literary thrillers and think about how they recreated that experience that I had when I heard Aida telling her story of suspense, of cliffhangers, of wanting to know what was coming next. So, I learned actually a lot from, I remember I read a Ken Follett novel and kind of took it apart chapter by chapter and thought about how he built the structure. And it turned out that there was like a mathematical precision to the structure of this novel once you started to look at it. And how he wove together different characters, which is something I was trying to do with the stories of Raul and Rosy and Emma, along with Aida's story. So I don't think that's going to win me a lot of points in the literary world, perhaps, but it was something to for me to just go down to the studs, as it were, to try to learn how one produces some of these narrative effects. I actually stayed a little bit away from the genre of kind of border memoirs, which there are some really incredible ones. But I tried to stay away from them a little bit because I didn't want to be too influenced by those stories. But also, my background in college was Latin American studies and Latin American literature, and I studied that in my master's program. And so there's definitely kind of a tradition of Latin American storytelling that kind of found its way into the book as well, I think.
Well, perhaps it's your willingness to, perhaps Latin American literature is there in your willingness to follow these stories that seem to lead into these tangents, especially, there's this great story of Emma who ends up becoming Aida's lover, who is an Ecuadorian soccer player who has this whole LGBTQ story in Ecuador that you tell in such, you tell it to the level of detail of being in the dining room with her lover and her mother, and the foot tapping that's going underneath under the table. It was just really absolutely wonderful. And I think your willingness to go with that and not see it as a distraction, really, I could feel the Latin American novel working there, perhaps.
Yeah, and each piece of the story emerged over time too. I didn't know it all at the beginning, of course, and I remember multiple times thinking oh, I guess we're going there. I hadn't known that this story would take us into the mountains, the guerrilla camps in the mountains of Chihuahua in the 1960s, or into kind of this incredible LGBTQ struggle in Ecuador. But each time we went there, I realized that it added another layer. It brought in a much broader variety of immigrant experiences, so that it was clear that Aida wasn't representative. She can't be representative of some immigrant experience. The Mexico piece with Raul was really important for getting at the fact that, that it's not just the United States that has militarized the US-Mexico border, and that there's a long authoritarian tradition in Mexico that people have been struggling against for decades, that plays out in contemporary border politics as well. So each time it took this tangent, I realized that it actually just, it brought new, each piece felt essential, even though I hadn't known that they were going to happen when I started off with the project.
I guess I'll make this my last question, and then see if we have any more from the audience. But so Aida has read the book, and I know this from our conversations that we've had. Can you tell us exactly what that process has been like? From publication and in the months that have followed. How has that been for her to see her story? Told still with a pseudonym, but it's still absolutely her story. To see it become a book and to go out there into the world. What's that been like for her in this process?
I got a call from her the other day where she said in a very confident way, I always knew that the book was going to make a difference in the world. Knew that. But what I hadn't known, she said, is that how much it would make a difference in my own life. And she kind of talked about how, in her words, that, she thinks about, people might see her on the street, or people she engages with might see her as trash, or kind of a problem. But that now she's got all of these people who have read her story and see her as a hero, someone who's unstoppable and has this, one of the big messages of the book is that there is just the sheer act of surviving the world we have made on the US-Mexico border is itself a form of dignity and worth that is as important as, some privileged person's accomplishments. And that people know that and see her as this hero of that. And I've been I forward her messages from readers who talk about that, and it's given her a confidence. There's also even more material aspects. So we didn't talk a bunch yet about the kind of the nitty gritty and nuts and bolts of how we went about doing this. But about 2 years into the project, we decided that we would split the proceeds for the book in 3 ways. 1/3 for her, 1/3 to support an organization working with people experiencing domestic and sexual violence on the border, and then 1/3 for me for the research expenses and fact checking and things like that. And since the book came out, Aida's share of the proceeds has actually been the thing that allowed her to participate in this really amazing program that trains LGBTQ people to be pure mental health counselors, which is kind of, Aida has always idolized Rosy, the social worker, and now she's able, through this program, to kind of train to be like a social worker, a pure mental health counselor. And that she couldn't have done that because it's not a paid internship. She couldn't have done that, or it's not a paid training program. She couldn't have done that without the proceeds for the book. So really material things. Even also at the level of like Rosy, who I always thought, I describe her as badass. She's such a powerful person. And in the story, comes across as so confident. And she texted me when the book came out, talking about how sometimes she doubts what she does. And to see her story in this book gave her a new sense of confidence. And then also so that her kids could read her story and understand what she does, and how powerful that was. So there's been some great, regardless of what the book does in other regards, there's been some great kind of individual level dynamics that were unexpected for me, but I think make it worth it.
Well, yeah, and I think for me, the power of it is that it reaches into communities where these experiences are really common, and people find really strong points of identification. I mean, there are literally millions of Aida Hernandez's, across the United States, in communities from Bakersfield and Calexico to Queens and the Bronx and all the places in between. And I think, there are so many elements of Aida's story that are replicated in those places, and, where people engage in the ordinary, courageous behavior that they need to get through every day, and to see that recounted so beautifully and so intelligently. There's so much smarts and respect for our community in this book that it's just really a wonderful testament to both your craft and also to Aida's story.
Wow. Thank you for that. That means a lot. And coming from you too, because you have such a fine sense of kind of the intimate levels and workings of power And I think about the barbarian nurseries and how you're able to capture the kind of Araceli and the Torres Townsend family, and just how these like minute little intimate gestures convey power and difference and the misunderstandings that flow from that. So I'm really grateful for that, what you're saying there. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's very generous of you. And we do have one last question here from our audience, which is what kinds of discrimination against LGBTQ and domestic violence victims are endemic to the immigration services?
Yeah. Yes, and it doesn't come up in the book either. It doesn't come up in the book because it didn't emerge in the story, but also quite a bit of discrimination against trans folks in immigration detention and the immigration detention system. One thing I talk about in the book is that if you go back to this, just to unpack that a little bit, if you go back to the 1990s, right, we created in the 1990s a border security strategy that was intentionally designed to funnel people to more dangerous sections of the border, more deadly sections of the border. And this is called prevention through deterrence, the strategy, and it became the single-minded focus of our immigration enforcement ever since then. And so when you see things like Border Patrol agents slashing water bottles in the desert, or kids in cages, or denying people vaccines in immigration detention, like, it's important to remember that that's not the result of bad apples or just an artifact of the Trump administration, but it's actually the outcome of a 27-year bipartisan strategy designed to make border crossing more traumatic, with the idea that that would somehow deter immigration. So within that context, it's important to know that our immigration system both nurtures and benefits from violence against women. And so one way you see that in the text is with abusive men who have power in that relationship, because they say, oh, if you call the police and I'll get a slap on the wrist, but you'll get deported. Right down to the fact that the cartels that are exploiting and abusing people on the border, if you think about them from the strict logic of prevention through deterrence, they're actually our allies. They're doing the work of the US government, designed to make the border crossing more traumatic and dangerous. We've outsourced some of the worst violence to those cartels, right? So thinking about the ways in which abuse and violence is built into the immigration system, not an exception or a collateral piece of it. I think I've strayed a little bit from the question about discrimination against LGBTQ people in the immigration system, and then the violence against women section. And it's an interesting, actually, the immigration system does have a kind of an important focus on violence against women. It's an ironic thing, right? Where our system is creating trauma and creating violence against women, but it's also one of the few areas where we've been willing to expand the range of who could qualify for a kind of asylum-like protection in the United States. Well, we've been shutting the door on asylum in many regards, and you get many people who can't qualify for asylum, who really should, fleeing from horrific violence in Central America or Mexico, can't qualify for asylum. But we have recognized that violence against women as an important category where we're allowing people to claim asylum. So it's a really interesting contradiction where our immigration system is producing violence against women and these forms of discrimination, but we're also kind of, getting to pretend like we're a great country because we're so tolerant and welcoming and we'll give people asylum based on, fleeing from horrific countries where violence against women is systemic, as if it weren't here also. So there's some contradictions within our immigration system around that particular question. And Aida is actually able to win her green card, right? Win her legal residency through part of that system, through the Violence Against Women Act. So it's crucial and important for her. But it's a kind of complicated part of our immigration system because it requires kind of the performance of being a particularly kind of deserving sufferer.
Right.
That we can feel benevolent about helping. As opposed to, how about the fact that we have an obligation to people who are fully makers and members of their community, rather than seeing citizenship as something that like gets granted out of benevolence.
Well, all those issues are just so powerfully illustrated in your book, Aaron. In the intimate, truths of Aida's life and these larger historical realities about violence and social control. And so congratulations really on an incredible book. And it's just been such a great honor to read it and to be able to be here in this virtual space to discuss it with you, Aaron. So thank you so much.
Oh, really fun talking with you. And wow, and I can't wait for your new novel to come out. When does it come out?
Yes, my novel is out August 25th. It's called The Last Great Road Bum, and it's a historical novel based on the life of a real life person. And so August 25th, it'll be out. It's like your book, it goes to many unexpected places. It starts in Urbana, Illinois, and it ends up in the hills of El Salvador during the Civil War and Revolution there.
I can't wait. It's great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. Thank you to all who joined us tonight. You can pre-order Hector's book from our website, and you can buy The Death and Life of Aida Hernandez at our bookstore as well. We'll ship it to you wherever you live. Yeah, thank you guys for joining us tonight. This was a really incredibly insightful, powerful conversation, and we really appreciate it. We appreciate the opportunity to bring it to our customers and to people tuning in all over the country. So thanks again. Have a great evening and take care all and stay safe.